They say you can measure a man by the shine on his shoes, but they never tell you what happens when those shoes are caked in 40 years of ranch mud. For 4 decades, I wore the same faded denim jacket, the same scuffed leather boots, and worked from sunrise to long past dusk on the Oak Ridge estate. I patched the leaky roofs, greased the rusted tractors, fixed the broken fences, and kept 500 acres of prime timber and pasture land running like a fine Swiss watch. To the town of Oak Ridge, I was just Thomas, the quiet, aging handyman who lived in the small wooden cabin at the edge of the creek. Most people barely glanced my way when I drove my beat-up red pickup into town for diesel and hardware supplies. And that was fine by me. I never cared for fancy titles, polished suits, or loud talkers. The estate belonged to my lifelong friend and elder brother in spirit, Richard Vance. Richard and I had built Oak Ridge together back when it was nothing more than rock, overgrown brush, and wild horses. While Richard managed the cattle sales and legal contracts, I poured my sweat into the soil. We had a bond sealed not by lawyers, but by trust. When Richard fell ill 3 years ago, I stayed by his bedside every single night. And when he passed away, a piece of my soul went into the ground with him. I thought Richard's children, his son, Brandon, and daughter-in-law, Victoria, would honor his legacy. I thought they would remember how hard their father had worked, and how much I had sacrificed to protect this land. I was dead wrong. Greed doesn't wait for the dirt to settle on a grave. The moment the funeral flowers withered, Brandon and Victoria arrived from the city in their sleek black sports cars, tailored clothes, and eyes full of dollar signs. They didn't see a legacy. They didn't see 40 years of history. They saw a massive real estate payout waiting to be carved up and sold to commercial developers. And standing in the middle of their $1 million plan was a 70-year-old handyman who knew every secret buried in the dirt. It was a cold, overcast Thursday afternoon when the storm officially hit. I was kneeling near the main barn, replacing a snapped hydraulic line on the old farm tractor. My hands were stained with black grease, and mud had soaked through the knees of my jeans. The wind was picking up, carrying the sharp scent of coming rain. The crunch of gravel signaled their arrival. A white luxury SUV pulled up right in front of the barn door, blocking the light. Victoria stepped out first. She was 35, wearing expensive leather boots that had never touched real dirt, an immaculate cashmere coat, and sunglasses even though the sky was dark gray. Behind her walked Brandon, looking nervous, tapping impatiently on his smartphone. Victoria looked around the barn with absolute disgust, holding a scented handkerchief to her nose as if the smell of hay and engine oil was toxic. "Thomas!" Victoria called out, her sharp voice echoing off the high wooden rafters. I wiped my greasy hands on a rag, slowly stood up, and brushed the dirt from my knees. "Afternoon, Victoria." "Brandon, what brings you out to the barn?" "Rain's coming in hard." Brandon wouldn't meet my eyes. He kept staring down at his phone, clearing his throat awkwardly. But Victoria stepped right into my workspace, her eyes cold and condescending. "We don't have time for weather reports, Thomas," Victoria said crisply. "The appraisal team is arriving tomorrow morning. We've signed a preliminary agreement with Crestview Properties. They're buying the entire 500 acres. They're tearing down the barns, clearing the timber, and breaking ground on a luxury golf resort by next month." My heart dropped into my stomach. The air suddenly felt thin, hard to breathe. "Tearing down the barns?" I asked, my voice low and steady despite the wave of shock hitting me. "Victoria, your father spent 30 years building this timber. He promised the town this land would remain a working ranch. It was his dream." Victoria let out a short, high-pitched laugh that sounded like cracking ice. "Richard's dream is dead, Thomas," she snapped. "And sentimentality doesn't pay real estate taxes. We're liquidating the property. Which brings us to you." She pulled a thin, white envelope from her designer tote bag and held it out toward me, using 2 fingers as if she didn't want to touch my calloused hands. "What's this?" I asked. "It's your termination notice," Victoria replied without a shred of emotion. "And an eviction order for the creek cabin. You have 72 hours to pack your personal belongings and clear off the property." I stared at the envelope. 40 years of my life. 40 years of sweat, blood, and broken bones, reduced to a piece of paper handed to me like trash. 72 hours. I looked at Brandon, my voice trembling with a mix of heartbreak and rising anger. "Brandon, you grew up on this land. I taught you how to ride your first horse. I taught you how to drive a tractor. You're going to let her throw me out like an old dog?" Brandon shifted uncomfortably on his feet, avoiding my gaze. "Look, Thomas, it's business. You're 70 years old. You can't handle the physical work anymore anyway. The estate is ours now. We need to clear all encumbrances before the sale goes through." "Encumbrances?" I repeated softly. "Is that what I am to you? An encumbrance?" Victoria took a step closer, her eyes flashing with pure arrogance. "Let's speak plainly, Thomas," she sneered, dropping the envelope onto the muddy floor near my boots. "You were just hired help. My father paid you a wage, and you lived rent-free in a rundown shack. You don't own a single blade of grass here. You're broke, you're old, and you have no say in what happens to Oak Ridge Estate." She leaned in, her voice dripping with venom. "So pick up your notice, pack your bags, and get off our land. You're yesterday's trash." The rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets, tapping against the corrugated tin roof of the barn. I looked down at the white envelope lying face down in the mud, right next to the scuffed toe of my work boot. I didn't reach down to pick it up. Instead, I slowly looked up at Victoria, whose cold, triumphant smirk made it clear she thought she had just won the ultimate victory. 72 hours, I repeated, my voice calm, steady, and lower than the sound of the thunder rumbling over the mountains. 72 hours, Thomas, Victoria said, adjusting her designer sunglasses onto her head. "And don't bother taking any tools from the barn. Everything on this ranch belongs to the Vance estate now. If you so much as touch a hammer, I'll have the county sheriff arrest you for theft." Brandon took a small, nervous step forward. Victoria, maybe we can give him a couple of weeks, or a small severance check." Victoria whipped her head around, glaring at her husband with pure contempt. "Severance for what, Brandon? He was paid a monthly stipend for 40 years. He doesn't get a golden parachute for doing basic maintenance. We have a $50 million deal with Crestview Properties closing in 30 days. We aren't delaying anything for a glorified farmhand." I looked at Brandon, the boy who used to cry on my shoulder when he fell off his bike, the boy whose father had tried so hard to instill character and humility in him. He shrunk under his wife's glare, looking down at his polished leather dress shoes, completely silent. "All right," I said, taking a step back into the dry shade of the barn. "I hear you, Victoria. You've made your position very clear." "Good," she sneered, turning on her heel and heading back toward the luxury SUV. "We'll be back on Monday morning with the surveyors. If your cabin isn't cleared out by then, the moving crew will throw your things into the creek." I watched as the white SUV backed out of the muddy gravel lot, its red taillights disappearing into the thick gray mist of a storm. I stood alone in the barn for a long time, listening to the rain. They thought I was just a broke handyman. They thought Richard had kept me around out of pity, paying me a meager allowance while keeping all the wealth for his family. They assumed that because I wore dirty jeans and drove a rusted truck, I had nothing. What Brandon and Victoria didn't know, what no one in this town knew, was the true nature of the agreement between Richard Vance and me. 40 years ago, when Richard and I bought this land, it wasn't Richard's money that secured the 500 acres. It was mine. I was 30 years old back then, fresh out of the military with a substantial inheritance from my grandfather's timber business in Oregon. Richard had the business mind and the vision, but he didn't have the capital. I had the capital, but I hated paperwork, city meetings, and public attention. So, we made a deal signed in blood and brotherhood. We created a hidden holding company, Oak Ridge Holdings, LLC. The public deed was placed in Richard's name, so he could manage the ranch, while 50% of the hidden master trust remained quietly in my name. Over the decades, every dollar the ranch made was reinvested into private land purchases, timber bonds, and commercial real estate across 3 states. Richard and I had agreed that I would live quietly as the estate's manager, keeping my true ownership completely secret from the world, and especially from his children, until the right time. Richard knew his son Brandon was weak-willed, and he knew Victoria was a ruthless social climber who only cared about money. Before Richard passed away, he called me to his bedside at the hospital. I can still hear his raspy voice echoing in my head. "Thomas, if my kids turn out greedy, if they try to destroy the land to line their pockets, open the iron box in the floorboards under your cabin. Show them who really owns Oak Ridge. I walked out of the barn and made my way down the narrow dirt path leading to the creek. The rain soaked through my jacket, but I barely felt the cold. My cabin was a small, cozy timber house set among the pine trees. Inside, it smelled of dried herbs, pine wood, and old books. I walked over to the corner of the living room, rolled back the heavy braided rug, and pried up 2 loose floorboards near the hearth. Nestled deep in the foundation was a heavy, rusted iron box sealed with a combination padlock. My hands didn't shake as I dialed the code, the date Richard and I had bought our first acre of land, June 14, 84. The lock clicked open with a heavy metallic sound. Inside lay a thick manila folder tied with yellow ribbon, along with a sealed black leather binder. Inside that binder were the original, unedited articles of incorporation for Oak Ridge Holdings, LLC, a notarized irrevocable trust agreement, and a secret codicil to Richard's last will and testament, executed by the state's most prestigious law firm in the capital. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Richard Vance did not own 500 acres of land outright. He owned 50%. The other 50% belonged to me. Furthermore, the trust explicit contract contained a legacy clause. If any attempt was made to sell the land for commercial development without the unanimous consent of both primary partners, full voting control and total ownership of all assets would instantly transfer to the surviving partner. To the world, I was just Thomas the handyman. But on paper, I own the entire 500 acres. I own the timber rights. And I own the very house Brandon and Victoria were sleeping in. I closed the binder and picked up my phone. It was time to call Harold Vance, Richard's estranged younger brother, who also happened to be the senior partner at the city's top corporate law firm. "Harold," I said when he answered on the second ring. "It's Thomas." There was a long pause on the line. "Thomas, did they do it?" "They handed me an eviction notice an hour ago," I replied quietly. "They're selling the land to Crestview Properties." Harold let out a cold, sharp laugh over the line. "Those greedy fools. They really thought they could push you into the dirt. What do you want to do, Thomas?" I looked out the cabin window at the towering green pines swaying in the storm. "I want you to file an emergency injunction, Harold," I said, my voice turning to iron, "and set up a meeting for Monday morning at the main estate house. Tell them the master trustee of Oak Ridge Holdings is coming to collect." Section 3. The gathering at the main house. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky that made the rain from the weekend feel like a distant memory. At precisely 9 o'clock, a silver town car pulled up the long, tree-lined driveway of the main Oak Ridge estate. Out stepped Harold Miller, carrying his signature leather briefcase, his tailored dark suit sharply pressed. Walking right beside him was Marcus Vance, managing partner of Apex Equity Group, looking quietly formidable. I met them near the wide stone porch of the main house. I wasn't wearing my work overalls today. Instead, I wore a crisp white-collared shirt under a dark navy wool jacket, clean, dignified, and steady. Inside the main house, Brandon and Victoria were sitting at the dining table with 2 representatives from Crestview Properties. Spread across the long oak table were blueprints, financial projections, and the final purchase contract waiting to be signed. Victoria was laughing, holding a glass of sparkling water, already celebrating the $50 million deal. The front door opened, and the sound of our footsteps echoed down the marble hallway. Victoria snapped her head toward the doorway, her smile instantly evaporating when her eyes landed on me. "Thomas," she scoffed, setting her glass down hard enough to rattle the ice. "What on earth are you doing in the main house? I gave you until 9 o'clock to clear your junk out of the creek cabin. Why aren't you loading your truck?" Brandon stood up, looking visibly irritated. "Thomas, this is a private meeting. We're in the middle of closing a major commercial transaction. You can't just walk in here." Harold stepped forward, resting his leather briefcase onto the edge of the dining table with a solid, echoing thud. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," Harold said, his voice quiet yet carrying total authority. "I suggest you put your pens down. This meeting is officially halted." Victoria narrowed her eyes, surveying Harold and Marcus. "Who are you?" "If you're here from the county zoning board, our legal team has already cleared the environmental permits." "I am Harold Miller, legal counsel representing Oak Ridge Holdings, LLC," Harold replied smoothly, unbuttoning his suit jacket as he opened his briefcase. "And this is Marcus Vance, managing partner of Apex Equity Group, the primary institutional investor holding the underlying mortgages on your personal townhome, as well as Vance Interior Concepts. Victoria's face went rigid. The color drained from her cheeks in an instant. Apex? What does Apex have to do with the Oak Ridge estate? Everything, Harold said. He pulled out a thick stack of certified legal documents and laid them squarely over the blueprints on the table. 14 months ago, Harold explained, Vance Interior Concepts took on a $200,000 line of credit secured by personal guarantees and cross-collateralized against your expected inheritance from the Vance estate. Under Clause 4B of that agreement, any attempt to sell or encumber the underlying real estate asset without prior written authorization from the primary holder of Oak Ridge Holdings LLC constitutes immediate default. Brandon looked completely lost, switching his gaze between Harold and his wife. Victoria, what is he talking about? What line of credit? Victoria glared at Harold, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the papers. That's impossible. Oak Ridge Holdings was my father's entity. As his sole legal heirs, Brandon and I hold 100% of the equity. You hold 50% of the revocable estate interest, Ms. Vance, Harold corrected her sternly. You do not hold voting control, and you certainly do not own the master trust. Then who does? Victoria shouted, her voice breaking with frustration. Who owns the other 50%? Harold stepped aside and gestured toward me. The founder, primary shareholder, and sole managing trustee of Oak Ridge Holdings LLC, Harold announced, is Mr. Thomas Vance. The room went completely dead silent. The two representatives from Crestview Properties exchanged nervous glances before slowly closing their notebooks and pulling their hands back from the contract. Brandon stared at me, his jaw dropping open. Thomas, you own half the ranch. I don't own half the ranch, Brandon, I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was calm, clear, and carried 40 years of weight. Under the terms of the master trust agreement signed by your father 40 years ago, I own full voting control of the entire 500 acres. And under the legacy clause your father added 3 years ago, any unauthorized attempt to liquidate this land for commercial development automatically forfeits your inherited share into an irrevocable community trust. Victoria looked like she had been struck by lightning. She looked frantically at the Crestview representatives, then at Brandon, and finally at me. You're lying, she screamed, her voice shrill with terror. You're just a farmhand, a dirty, broke old handyman. You forged these papers. You manipulated my father when he was sick. Every document in that binder bears your father's notarized signature, Harold replied coldly, along with a video deposition recorded 6 months before his passing, explicitly warning that if you attempted to destroy Oak Ridge for fast cash, Thomas was authorized to execute full asset recovery. Marcus Vance stepped forward, pulling a thin tablet from his inner coat pocket. Furthermore, Ms. Vance, Marcus added, Apex Equity Group executed its contractual rights as of 8 o'clock this morning. Due to your default on Clause 4B, all corporate accounts associated with Vance Interior Concepts have been frozen, and foreclosure proceedings have commenced on your city townhome. Victoria sank into her dining chair, her face ghost white, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. Brandon stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of the sideboard to keep from falling. Mom! Thomas, please. We didn't know. We were just trying to secure our future. I looked at Brandon, then at Victoria, whose arrogant smile had completely vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of her own greed. You were given a choice, Brandon, I said softly. You could have honored your father's memory and protected this land. Instead, you tried to throw me into the dirt like trash. Now, the dirt is coming back for what's hers. Section 4. The Unraveling of the Empire. The two representatives from Crestview Properties didn't waste another second. They quickly packed up their leather portfolios, slid the blueprints into their carrying tubes, and stood up from the mahogany table. We are officially withdrawing our purchase offer, Mr. Vance, the lead representative said, tipping his hat slightly toward me. Crestview does not engage in contested property disputes or clouded titles. Good day. They exited the main house, leaving the front door swinging slightly in the cool breeze. Victoria sat motionless in her dining chair, her hands gripping the fabric of her designer skirt, so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her husband, Brandon, stood trembling near the window, staring at the floor as if waiting for the ground to swallow him whole. This isn't real," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking as she finally raised her head. "You can't just take everything. We spent 3 years building up our business lines. We relied on the sale of this property to clear our corporate debt." "You didn't rely on the sale of the property to clear debt, Victoria," Harold Miller replied, pulling a fresh set of financial audit pages from his briefcase. "You relied on the expected liquidation of Oak Ridge Estate to fund a lifestyle you couldn't afford. Over the last 18 months, you drew $200,000 from business lines of credit for luxury vehicles, high-end travel, and personal expenses, fraudulently listing this ranch as unencumbered collateral." Harold set the audited balance sheets right in front of her. "That is commercial fraud," Harold stated bluntly. "If Thomas chose to press charges today, the state attorney general would open a criminal investigation by tomorrow morning." Brandon rushed over to the table, dropping to his knees beside my chair. Tears welled up in his eyes, his voice desperate and cracked. "Thomas, please," Brandon begged, looking up at me with the same terrified eyes he had as a child when he got lost in the woods. "I was stupid. I listened to Victoria. She told me we were entitled to the money, that you were just managing the grounds. I didn't know about the trust. Please, don't ruin us." I looked down at Brandon. The anger that had burned in my chest for the past 3 days didn't turn into joy at his misery. It turned into a deep, heavy sadness. "You didn't know about the trust, Brandon," I said softly, "because your father wanted to see what kind of man you would become when you thought no one was watching. He wanted to see if you would honor his memory, or if you would let greed consume you." I reached out and picked up the white envelope Victoria had thrown into the mud 3 days ago, which I had placed neatly on the table. "You gave me 72 hours to pack my life into boxes and leave," I said, holding the paper out toward Brandon. "You didn't care where an old man would go. You didn't care about 40 years of dedication. You only cared about how much money you could squeeze out of the dirt." Victoria suddenly bolted up from her chair, her eyes burning with a desperate, chaotic fury. "Don't beg him, Brandon," she shrieked, grabbing her husband by the arm and pulling him up. "He's bluffing. He's just an old handyman playing games with legal papers. We'll hire our own lawyers. We'll fight this trust in court. We'll prove Richard was incompetent when he signed those papers." Harold let out a cold, sharp laugh. "Try it, Ms. Vance. The video deposition was certified by 3 independent board-certified psychiatrists on the day of signing. If you take this to court, not only will you lose, but the legal fees will accelerate Apex Equity Group's immediate asset foreclosure on every single property you own." Victoria froze. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had no moves left. The chessboard had been completely cleared, and she was trapped in the corner. "You have 24 hours to vacate the main house," I said, standing up from my chair and buttoning my coat. "Take your clothes and your personal belongings, but leave the keys to the ranch vehicles on the kitchen counter." I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy front doors, Harold and Marcus following right beside me. As the door closed behind us, the muffled sounds of Victoria's hysterical screaming and Brandon's desperate crying echoed through the high ceilings of the estate. By Tuesday afternoon, the ripple effects of the frozen credit lines hit Victoria's business with the force of a tidal wave. Without the influx of capital she had promised her creditors, Vance Interior Concepts was slammed with immediate legal demands. Contractors who hadn't been paid for months stopped work on every major project. Vendors froze shipments of high-end materials, and several corporate clients canceled their retainer contracts within 48 hours after word spread that the firm was facing foreclosure. I spent Tuesday morning walking the perimeter of the timberland with Harold and the county forest conservator. We were marking old pine trees for seasonal thinning, ensuring the land stayed healthy for decades to come, just as Richard and I had always done. As we walked back toward the main driveway, a flatbed tow truck pulled up to the main house, followed by a local deputy sheriff. Victoria was standing on the front porch, frantically screaming into her phone while waving her arms at the tow truck driver. Parked in the circular driveway was her sleek white luxury SUV, the very car she had driven up to the barn days ago to hand me my eviction notice. "You can't take this car," Victoria screamed at the deputy, her voice raw and hoarse. "This is a corporate lease. My lawyer is filing an emergency stay right now." The deputy sheriff, a calm, middle-aged man who had known me and Richard for 20 years, didn't flinch. He adjusted his belt and held out an official court order. "Ms. Vance, this repossession warrant was issued by the county court 3 hours ago," the deputy said calmly. "Apex Equity Group has called in the loan default. Hand over the keys, or I'll be forced to take you into custody for obstructing a court order." Brandon stood near the front door, looking hollowed out. He had 2 bruised-looking dark circles under his eyes, his designer suit replaced by a wrinkled polo shirt and unlaced sneakers. He didn't even try to defend her. He just stared at the ground as the tow truck driver hooked heavy steel chains to the front axle of the luxury vehicle. Victoria turned around and spotted me, standing near the edge of the lawn with Harold. She marched down the porch steps, her heels digging into the gravel, her face twisted in pure rage. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she yelled, stopping 10 feet away from me as the deputy watched closely. "You set us up. You sat in that miserable little cabin for years, waiting for Richard to die, so you could steal this property." I kept my hands folded behind my back, looking at her with a steady, quiet gaze. "I didn't steal anything, Victoria," I said evenly. "I protected what your father built. You tried to sell 40 years of his hard work to line your pockets for a few years of luxury. You destroyed your own business the moment you built it on debt and lies." "We're going to sue you," she shrieked, tears of fury cutting through her heavy makeup. "We'll take this to the Supreme Court. You're just a handyman. You don't belong in a house like this." "The court has already spoken, Victoria," Harold interrupted, stepping forward with his briefcase. "Apex Equity Group has finalized the foreclosure on your city townhome as of 12 o'clock today. The locks will be changed by 5 p.m. If you have personal items there, I suggest you collect them immediately." Victoria gasped, dropping her phone onto the gravel. "Our townhome! You have no credit, no corporate accounts, and no claim to Oak Ridge Estate," Harold added without a trace of pity. "Your empire didn't fall because of Thomas. It fell because it was built on sand." The loud clanking of metal echoed across the driveway as the tow truck lifted her vehicle into the air. Victoria watched her prize status symbol drive away down the gravel road, leaving a cloud of dust in the bright afternoon sun. She collapsed onto the bottom porch step, buried her face in her hands, and began to sob hysterically. Brandon walked slowly down the steps, picked up her dropped phone, and looked at me one last time. There was no defiance left in his eyes, only deep, painful regret. "I'm sorry, Thomas," Brandon whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his wife's crying. "Dad was right about me. I wasn't man enough to stand up for what was right." "You still have a chance to become a man, Brandon," I said softly. "But you won't do it with her money, and you won't do it on this land. Take your wife and leave." By Wednesday afternoon, the main estate house was completely silent. Brandon and Victoria had packed what little they could fit into 2 rented suitcases, leaving behind the heavy leather furniture, the crystal glassware, and the grand pretense of wealth they had carried with them for years. A taxicab from town had come to pick them up, carrying them away to a cheap budget motel near the highway, the only place they could afford with the small amount of cash remaining in Brandon's personal checking account. I stood on the front porch of the main house, watching the taillights fade down the long dirt driveway. The quiet of Oak Ridge Estate returned, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the heavy, somber calm that settles over a battlefield after the storm has passed. Harold Miller walked out onto the porch, carrying a warm cup of coffee and setting a folder on the wooden railing. "The formal transfer paperwork is complete, Thomas," Harold said softly, looking out over the 500 acres of pine trees and green pastures. "The court has finalized the master trust control. The foreclosure on their city properties is moving forward, and Crestview Properties has officially removed Oak Ridge from their acquisition portfolio. The land is completely safe." "Safe," I repeated, staring out toward the timberline. "You don't look like a man who just won a $50 million battle," Harold observed, taking a sip of his coffee. "Because there's no joy in watching a brother's son fall into the mud, Harold," I replied, turning to look at him. Richard didn't want Brandon destroyed. He wanted him tested. Greed made him fail, but he's still Richard's blood. Harold nodded slowly. "So, what are you going to do?" 3 days later, I drove my old red pickup truck down to the edge of town, pulling into the parking lot of a small, worn-down automotive repair shop near the highway. Standing near the grease-stained bay doors was Brandon. His designer suit was gone, replaced by a pair of heavy work pants and a dark blue shirt with a small stitched name tag that read Brandon. He was lifting heavy steel tires onto a storage rack, his forehead drenched in sweat, his hands dark with axle grease. Victoria was nowhere to be seen. I had heard through Harold that she had left for her parents' house in another state the moment she realized Brandon had no access to the Vance Trust Fund. Their marriage, built entirely on the expectation of instant wealth, had dissolved in less than a week. Brandon stopped when he heard the familiar rumble of my truck engine. He wiped his sweaty brow with the back of his arm and slowly walked over to the driver's side window, looking down at the ground with a mixture of embarrassment and shame. "Thomas," Brandon said, his voice quiet, "if you're here to tell me to get out of town, you don't have to. I'm just working here to pay off my personal credit debt." I stepped out of the truck, the rusted door creaking in the afternoon air. I leaned back against the fender and looked at his hands, calloused, dirt-stained, and raw from hard work. "You look like your father used to look when we were 30, I said quietly. Brandon let out a self-deprecating laugh, shaking his head. "Don't mock me, Thomas. My father was a real man. He built an empire. I let a greedy woman turn me into a coward, and I tried to steal from the only person who actually cared about this family." "I'm not mocking you, Brandon," I replied, pulling a white legal document from my jacket pocket. "Your father left a second codicil in the iron box, one that was only meant to be opened after you hit rock bottom." Brandon looked up, his eyes widening slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Richard knew you had a weak spirit, but he believed you had your mother's heart buried deep under that city polish," I explained, handing him the envelope. "The trust didn't disinherit you forever. It placed your 50% share into a conditional legacy account." Brandon froze, staring at the paper in his hands as if it were made of glass. "Conditional," he whispered. "If you work 500 hours of honest, physical labor, proving you can earn your bread without relying on debt or legal tricks, you earn back a non-voting 5% share of the estate's annual dividends," I stated. "And every year you stay on an honest path, that share grows. But you will never own the land to sell it. You will only own the duty to protect it." Tears began to stream down Brandon's grease-stained cheeks, leaving light tracks through the dirt on his face. He fell to his knees right there on the gravel parking lot, clutching the envelope to his chest, weeping not out of anger or greed, but out of pure, overwhelming gratitude. "Why are you doing this for me?" Brandon sobbed. "After everything I said to you, after how I treated you?" I reached down, took him by the shoulder, and pulled him up to his feet. "Because your father didn't build Oak Ridge Estate to make his family rich," I said softly, looking him straight in the eyes. "He built it to make his family strong. Now pick up your tools, Brandon. You got 490 hours left to work." 6 months passed, and the autumn leaves turned brilliant shades of crimson and gold across the 500 acres of Oak Ridge Estate. The dark clouds of legal battles, repossession notices, and greed had finally cleared away, leaving behind the quiet dignity that had defined this land for 40 years. The commercial developers from Crestview Properties had long given up, moving their real estate machinery to another county, while Oak Ridge remained pristine, whole and untouched. Every morning at sunrise, I walked out to the main barn, carrying my warm mug of coffee. But I wasn't working alone anymore. Across the gravel yard, the heavy wooden barn doors swung open. Out stepped Brandon, wearing a worn denim work jacket, heavy leather boots, and a grease-stained cap. His hands were calloused, his skin tanned from long hours in the sun, and the hollow, anxious look he used to carry in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, grounded strength. He had completed his 500 hours of physical labor at the auto shop, paying off every cent of his personal debts without asking for a single dollar from the estate. And when his hours were complete, he didn't run back to the city. He asked to come home. "Morning, Thomas," Brandon called out, his voice clear and steady as he walked over toward the tractor shed. "I checked the timber fences along the south border yesterday. 2 posts near the creek were rotting out, so I loaded some fresh cedar posts onto the flatbed. I'll have them replaced by noon." I looked at him, feeling a familiar warmth in my chest, the kind of pride Richard used to feel when he watched his farm hands work with purpose. "Good work, Brandon," I replied, taking a sip of coffee. "Make sure you check the drainage culverts, near the low pasture too. Rain's expected by Friday." "Already on it," Brandon smiled, tipping his cap before climbing into the driver's seat of the old red pickup truck, the very truck he once looked down upon with disgust. Victoria never returned. After her attempt to sue the estate failed under the mountain of notarized evidence, her family cut off her allowance, forcing her to take an entry-level job at a boutique retail store in the city. Her life of unearned luxury, expensive sports cars, and arrogant dominance over others had vanished like smoke in the wind. She had tried to steal an empire built on 40 years of sweat, and ended up with nothing but the clothes on her back and the weight of her own choices. That afternoon, Harold Miller drove up the long driveway, carrying the finalized legal papers for the community trust. We sat together on the front porch of the main house, the same porch where Victoria had once stood demanding my eviction. "Brandon's transformation is remarkable, Thomas," Harold said, watching Brandon maneuver the truck toward the timberline in the distance. "I didn't think he had it in him." "People change when you remove the poison from their ears, Harold," I said softly, looking out at the rolling green hills. "He was never evil. He was just weak. But hard work has a way of washing away weakness." "And what about you?" Harold asked, leaning back against the wooden porch pillar. "The Master Trust gives you full authority to live in the main house, to hire a full team of estate managers, to take whatever wealth you want from the timber yields. Yet you still sleep in your little cabin by the creek." I looked down at my hands, worn, lined, and permanently stained by 40 years of soil and grease. "A big house doesn't make a man comfortable, Harold," I smiled softly. "Peace does. This land was never about status or money. It was about preserving something real in a world that's constantly trying to sell its soul for fast cash." 1 year later, the sun rose over Oak Ridge Estate with a brilliant, golden warmth, casting long, peaceful shadows across the lush pastures and the blooming white hydrangeas near the front garden. The estate was officially dedicated as the Vance Thomas Community Timber Preserve. Under the permanent terms of the irrevocable trust, not a single acre of the 500 could ever be sold, clear-cut, or turned into concrete resorts. It was protected forever, a living, breathing sanctuary for the wildlife, the trees, and the town that Richard and I had loved for half a century. Around noon, a small gathering of local townspeople, community leaders, and forest conservationists gathered on the lawn outside the main house. They came to celebrate the official opening of the preserve's youth forestry program, an initiative funded by the estate's timber yields to teach young men and women the values of hard work, conservation, and land stewardship. Brandon stood in front of the crowd, wearing a neatly tailored dark suit. But he wasn't the arrogant, anxious young man who had arrived in a sports car 18 months ago. When he spoke into the microphone, his voice was steady, humble, and filled with genuine conviction. "For a long time, I thought success meant how much money you had in your bank account, what kind of car you drove, or how many people you could look down upon," Brandon said, his voice echoing across the silent lawn. "I almost destroyed my family's legacy and betrayed the finest man I know out of pure, unadulterated greed. But I learned that real strength isn't about taking what isn't yours. It's about earning your place through sweat, honesty, and respect for those who came before you." He turned toward the edge of the porch, looking directly at me with eyes full of deep gratitude and love. "Everything I am today," Brandon continued, "and everything this land will ever be, is thanks to a man who never asked for praise, never cared for wealth, but spent 40 years standing tall like an oak tree in the storm. Thank you, Thomas." The crowd erupted into warm applause. Later that evening, after the last of the guests had driven away, I walked down the narrow dirt path toward my cabin by the creek. The air was fresh with the scent of pine and evening dew. I sat down in the wooden armchair on my sunlit porch, holding a warm porcelain teacup in my hands. Beside me on the small side table rested the old rusted iron box, now empty, its papers permanently registered in the public record where no greedy hand could ever touch them again. I took a slow sip of tea and looked out over the quiet, golden landscape. They say that greed buys comfort, but it can never buy peace. Victoria had chased status, debt-fueled luxury, and control, only to end up with nothing but bitter memories and a broken life. Brandon had walked through the fire of humiliation and hard labor, only to emerge as a true man worthy of his father's name. And as for me, I was still just Thomas, the handyman who lived in the cabin by the creek. I didn't need a golden throne or a $50 million payout. I had the land I had nurtured with my own 2 hands, the memory of a lifelong friend kept pure and unbroken, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when the storm came to test us, justice had prevailed. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon, bathing the craftsman house and the blooming hydrangeas in a peaceful, golden glow. Moral of the story: never mistake quiet humility for weakness, and never let greed blind you to the true value of loyalty and legacy. Money can buy title deeds, but it can never buy honor. Wealth acquired by betraying those who sacrificed for you will always turn to dust, while a life built on integrity, hard work, and truth will stand firm against any storm.